Yes. Namaste, everyone. Welcome.
Namaste and Hare Krishna, and welcome to everyone on our call this evening. And this is our first event for 2022, and we're very excited about it. Our presenter tonight is a very, very well-versed person in the Vedic culture, Vedic philosophy. So we're very excited to hear from Mark this evening, and I'm sure you're all going to benefit greatly from that. I was thinking of a verse from Bhagavad Gita that might kind of give us a sense of what the talk is going to be about. And I looked at verse chapter 3, text 17, and I'll do that verse real quick. Yes tvatma ratir eva syad atma triptas chamanavaha admanyeva shasantushtas tashyakaryam navidyate. But for one who takes pleasure in the self, whose human life is one of self-realization, and who is satisfied in the self only, fully satiated, for him there is no duty. So I think it's a very beautiful and appropriate verse. Mark is going to take us on a journey of self-discovery and how we can find peace and stability in our lives. And we're very excited about that. And as we entitle these talks, Tools for Human Empowerment. So we're all here to learn something, to add into our little toolbox of things that keep us on track. Little points, little verses, little ideas. And we're so excited, Mark, that you're going to share your immense wisdom. And as I mentioned earlier, you and I ran into each other probably in 1973 when Maharishi came to Atlanta, because I was there for that event.
Yeah.
So we're kind of like connecting again after all that time. So I'm very, very happy to have you here and looking forward to hearing you speak. So I'm going to have Anjali introduce you and give the bio. Anjali?
Namaste, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining. I have the privilege of giving out Mark G's bio. Mark Cohen, PhD. Mark Cohen received his PhD in Vedic science from Maharishi Vedic University in the Netherlands and his BA in interdisciplinary studies in psychology from the Maharishi International University. He learned Vedic science and became a certified teacher of transcendental meditation under the direct guidance of His Holiness Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who embodied both knowledge and direct experience of the highest reality of ancient Vedic science. Mark considers it to be the greatest blessing of his life to have studied and worked directly with Maharishi for many years. His PhD dissertation was on the specific one-to-one connections between the 40 aspects of the structuring dynamics of Veda and the structuring dynamics of human physiology as taught in Ayurveda. His special interest is in the connections between the development of higher states of consciousness, physiology, and the brain, and its impacts on individual and collective consciousness from the integrated perspective of ancient Vedic science as well as modern science. Mark has a special interest in the Trika Shaiva philosophy, also known as Kashmir Shaivism, as revealed by Swami Lakshman Ju. Mark has taught transcendental meditation and Vedic science to thousands of people throughout the world for 48 years. His clients come from all walks of life, but have included CEOs, C-suite executives, celebrities, and other high-performing individuals from Coke, CNN, Porsche, Care International, Cox Cable, Cox Enterprises, the National Basketball Association, etc. His passion is in helping individuals reach their full mental and physical potential and develop their creative intelligence to maximize star performance. He currently lives in Atlanta, Georgia, with his wife, Sharon. And without further ado, Mark G., the floor is yours.
So it's a great pleasure for me to be able to have a chance to address everyone. And I want to thank the Vedic Friends Association for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen because I want you to see a series of slides that I've created to help you understand the points that I'll be going over today. And so just let me know if everyone can see it. I'm just going to.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to hide this loading message. Okay. All right. So As Prabhuji said, that the theme of the series of talks is Tools for Human Empowerment, a Yogic Perspective. So I'd like to talk about how gaining enlightenment is the ultimate human empowerment. And so the title of my talk is How to Completely Eliminate Stress, Developing Enlightenment in Higher States of Consciousness. And it will include a description of transcendental meditation and, briefly how it works and the practical benefits of TM, and how TM can actually also bring total enlightenment. That's something that a lot of people don't know about transcendental meditation. When they may hear about it in the news, it's always touted in terms of its ability to dissolve stress and improve mental performance, etc., which it of course does, but it's also a path to total enlightenment. So we're going to review that. I think that'll be interesting for people. But I want to just acknowledge that this knowledge came from the Vedic Parampara tradition of teachers who are pictured here in this painting, and also from my teacher's teacher, who we call Guru Dev, His Divinity Swami Brahmananda Saraswati, and also my direct teacher, His Holiness Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who was a great scientist of consciousness. It was a great joy of mine to learn under Maharishi for many years. So I want to start with this Upanishadic shloka from the Shastras that basically says that the human condition, that human existence starts from unboundedness. It starts from unboundedness, it evolves into boundaries, and eventually it returns to unboundedness again. Here it's talking about bliss, that out of bliss, these beings are born. In bliss, they are sustained, and to bliss they go and merge again. We start from the infinite, and we come into the finite, and we return to the infinite again. We start from unboundedness, we come to boundaries, and we come to unboundedness again. We start from silence, unbounded silence, come into dynamism, and return back to silence again. This is the path of human evolution. And we're going to talk about that today, but I want to start by introducing the idea in terms of physics, actually. Now, I'm not a physicist. This is going to be a very simple explanation of how in physics, physics has sought to understand the source of all physical matter. That in the 20th century, with the advent of quantum physics, when they went from classical physics of studying billiard balls and macroscopic physical objects into getting to the microscopic and discovering molecules and atoms and subatomic particles, they eventually were able to understand that at a very tiny time and distance scale, 10 to the minus 14 centimeters, that there are 4 force and matter fields that underline and create the entire universe. The electromagnetic field, which is responsible for electricity, magnetism, and light; the weak interaction, which is proton decay in stars, background radiation in the universe; the strong interaction, which is the nuclear force; and then in gravity, space-time, gravity, which was Einstein's area. But great scientists like Einstein found it very inelegant that there could be 4 separate sources for the universe, because at the time that they understood these 4 forces, they didn't see any connectivity between them. And the idea there could be 4 separate sources to the diversified universe just didn't make any sense. So they set out to discover an underlying unified field. That's called unified field theory. By looking in tinier time and distance scales from theoretical physics, they found that at deeper levels of nature's functioning, instead of 10 to the minus 14 to 10 to the minus 16 centimeters, we see a unification of electromagnetism and weak interaction in what's called the electro-weak unification field, and Nobel Prizes have been awarded for the discovery of this field. At 10 to the minus 29 centimeters, that's 10 with 29 zeros after it, at least theoretically, they understand that the strong interaction is unified with the electro-weak field to create what's known as the grand unified field. Now there's only 2 fields here. And then finally, there's theoretical models that need some more work theoretically in physics, but they know intuitively that that gravity must be unified as well with grand unification, the gravitational field, at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, which is known as the Planck scale, which is really the tiniest time and distance scale where matter, space and time drops off into something quite transcendental, meaning very simply that there is one underlying unity, according to physics, one unified field, at the basis of all the diversity, all the laws of nature, all the elementary particles, which combine to create and administrate the entire universe in perfect order. From the one comes the many. So this is the direction that physics has gone. And it's very interesting that this field can be described in a mathematical formula called the Lagrangian of the field. Now, the way this field creates is through its own self-interaction. By self-interacting with itself, by knowing itself, it creates a stir within its own nature, and that stir breaks the wholeness, the symmetry of this field to create the asymmetry of the force and matter fields in the entire manifest universe. But this is called a Lagrangian of the unified field, which is a mathematical formula which I don't even begin to understand. But one physicist, Dr. John Hagelin, has translated these mathematical equations into English, like what are the qualities of this unified field according to physics? Now, I'm not going to read all of these qualities of the unified field according to physics, but they are precisely the same qualities that the Vedic tradition uses to describe the unbounded ocean of consciousness that the Vedic tradition maintains is the basis of everything, that in fact is everything, that there's one unbounded ocean of consciousness in motion, one unbounded ocean of consciousness at the source of all manifest diversity in the universe. And according to the Vedic tradition, this field has qualities, just in the same way that physics says that at the basis of all physical matter, that it's self-referral in nature, and the only thing that we know that is self-referral is consciousness. So we're saying really that the unified field and this unbounded field of consciousness is the same field. And so here are some of the qualities of this unbounded unity at the basis of my mind, and at the basis of your mind, and at the basis of everyone's mind, and at the basis of physical matter. So first of all, this field is Sat. It's non-changing absolute being. It's absolute. It never changes. It's infinitely truthful in the sense that it is absolute non-change, pure existence or being. It is Chit, meaning that it's consciousness. It has that power of consciousness because it interacts with itself. It knows itself through a process called Vimarsha. Vimarsha means self-awareness. It's fully awake within its own nature. It is Ananda or bliss because it knows itself, because it interacts with itself, because Prakritam Svama Vastabhya Visrajami Puna Puna, according to Lord Krishna in the Gita, it curves back on its own nature and creates everything. But that process of curving back on its own nature, knowing itself, through itself, by itself, creates an infinite vibration, an infinite frequency of dynamism, which is described as being infinitely blissful. It's Ananta. It's absolutely unbounded. It is infinite. Not only is this field at the source of everything bigger than you think it is bigger than you can think that it is, because you can't experience it on the level of individual thought. Thought has to be transcended, and you have to experience it directly. It itself can know itself, but nothing else can know it but itself. It knows itself by itself, through itself. So it's absolutely unbounded. It has no beginnings and endings in time. It has no edges in space. It's a Dvaita, which means it has no divisions in it. It's non-dual. It's non-diversified. It's absolutely oneness or unity. Sometimes Abheda is another Sanskrit term, which means it's non-differentiated. And it's also Shanti. It's infinitely silent, infinitely peaceful. No activity is found in that field. It's always infinitely restful, pure rest, infinite rest. But it's a very big, interesting conundrum and contradiction that this field is also described as having Shakti inherent in it. Shakti is that infinite dynamism, that power and energy which arises from that Vimarsha, that self-interaction, self-knowingness of this unbounded field of consciousness. Prakash, unbounded, the light of consciousness, knowing itself through Vimarsha, creates that infinite frequency of dynamism. So somehow it is both silent, infinitely, and infinitely dynamic. And later on, if you want an example of how that could even be, if we have time, I'll try to bring an example up in physics. It's akrama, meaning it's timeless without succession. It's vyapakatva, which means it's omnipresent. It's found absolutely everywhere the same. The unified field in its absolute, unbounded, eternal infinity of consciousness can be found in the grain of sand in the palm of your hand and the farthest edges of the universe. And it has a quality that in English physics calls infinite correlation, that as one physicist said, if you tickle it here, it laughs everywhere simultaneously. And the closest Sanskrit phrase that I could find that explains this quality of infinite correlation is sarvam sarvatmakam, which means everything is the self of everything else. That means that if you could stimulate the unified field beyond the Planck scale or at the level of unbounded infinite Satchitananda, pure consciousness, you're stimulating it everywhere in the universe simultaneously. There is no distance in space or sequence in time that separates the unified field at the basis of the grain of sand in your hand and the farthest edges of the universe. So every point of the unified field is not just correlated or connected to every other point. It's actually more accurate to say that every point of the unified field is every other point and is unbounded and infinite. But it's interesting that this unified field, through its own self-interaction and a process known in Sanskrit as pragyaparat, has the capability of manifesting into the manifest world, into the field of boundaries or objects. It goes from unboundedness to boundaries. And it does it through a process of its own, what's called divine infinite independence in the Vedic tradition, called Swatantriya in Kashmir, Trika Shaivism. And what that means is this unified field has these qualities of being chit shakti, unbounded, the power of consciousness, which gives it vyapakatva, it means it's all pervading, but it can limit its own nature in order to enjoy its unboundedness and boundaries through Swatantriya Shakti. And when it contracts itself and limits its unboundedness into boundaries, unbounded, all pervading consciousness becomes limited space. So that means that instead of feeling like you're infinitely everywhere, you feel like you're limited in time and space in this one place, limited in, I'm here in Atlanta, Georgia, in this house at 753, whatever the address is, exactly one place. The quality of Ananda Shakti, the infinite bliss, which gives it nityatva or eternity beyond space. When it limits itself, it becomes limited in time. So instead of feeling like you're beyond all time and in all time periods, you feel as if you're limited in time and you're just here in March 10th, 2022 at 8:15 p.m. The quality of the power of all will or Icha Shakti is pranatva, meaning this field is infinitely fulfilled. It's all fullness, but limiting itself, forgetting its own nature, it collapses down to this kanchuka, which, by the way, these things are called kanchukas or coverings, is raga, meaning it's limited attachment. It means you don't feel full inside. There's some emptiness there that promotes you always looking for happiness externally in the external objects of the universe, and that no matter what you find on the outside, you don't get that complete and total fulfillment. You then look for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing in limited time, space, outwardly through the five senses. It's all knowledge, jnana shakti, which is sarva gyatva, meaning this field is infinitely all-knowing. It knows everything at once at all time. It administrates everything at once at all time. And when that quality collapses down to a point, it becomes vidya, which means limited knowledge, which means I can't know everything at once. I can't be one with that supreme infinite intelligence that can know everything and administrate everything at once. I'm limited. I only can know one thing at a time. And then finally, Kriya Shakti, or all infinite dynamism, infinite action that creates and administrates the entire universe in perfect order, has the quality of sarva kartritva, which means all doingness. It does everything simultaneously in the universe, but through Swatantriya Shakti, it gets limited and contracted down to what's called kala, or limited action, meaning I can only do one thing at a time. So the effects of these coverings through Swatantriya Shakti basically creates the individual, that you think you're this limited individual in this physical body made up of the five elements and your mind, intellect, ego, personality that is limited in space, time with attachment, individual knowledge, and individual action. And by being this limited individual, you feel as if cut off from that totality through a process of pragyaparat, which means a mistake of the intellect. There's a forgetting of your own nature. You've lost what's called smriti, the memory of the unbounded eternal self. And instead, you think you are this limited mind body. seeking happiness, always outward. Kind of like an ocean rising on a wave, rising on the surface of the ocean. What is a wave? A wave is only fluctuating, unbounded ocean. A wave is fluctuating ocean. But that wave, in the process of moving outwardly and upwardly, outwardly away from the ocean, feels as if in time it forgets its connectedness to that unbounded ocean. And so it feels like it's a little isolated triangle of a wave in time and space that is separated from all the other little triangles in time and space that it might perceive around it. And as soon as that happens, then certainly as the Upanishads say, certainly fear is born of duality. Then fear is a possibility because there's the sense, the mistaken notion that there's something separate from your own self that could potentially turn around and be a threat to you. So fear is the first toxic emotion of duality. And from fear comes all other negative emotions and all the other negative actions that create unhappiness individually and in the family of humanity. So, but there's a great quote from the Upanishads, Yo vai bhuma tat sukham nalpe sukhamasti. This is from Chandogya Upanishad that says, that which is unbounded is happy. There is no joy in small things. Now, it doesn't mean that there's no happiness in the little outside things of life, but they're temporary waves that come and go on the ocean of life, and they don't create lasting happiness. That little individual wave of individuality knows intuitively that there's something more, that its home base is that unbounded, infinitely blissful infinity, but not feeling it. It's searching it and searching for it in that same direction that it's been conditioned to search for it from time immemorial, which is outwardly through attention, through our feelings and our thoughts, through the five senses and out to the objects of experience, through actions, desire, action, impression, and desire. We create waves of happiness, but those are small waves and they don't produce lasting infinite joy. The only thing that can make the mind quiet and still again and completely contented and have that purnatva, that fullness of bliss where nothing else remains to be known, is if it becomes merged back with its source, an unbounded bliss consciousness. So it's constantly seeking for love in all the wrong places. You remember that song from the 70s, searching for love or looking for love in all the wrong places. The individual self is just conditioned to look for happiness outwardly. And when it doesn't find it, it moves on to the next object and the next object and the next object. And you may have noticed, no matter how happy, whatever the biggest wave of thing you've ever been to achieve outwardly, whatever the most blissful thing you can think of in the outside world of boundaries, it hasn't produced lasting, true, infinite, omnipresent fulfillment. And that process of looking and searching and that incessant activity all the time subjects the individuality to exhaustion, to tiredness, to fatigue, to enormous excitations, because that unbounded, infinite dynamism of the self is lost to awareness. That unbounded field is infinite stability and infinite restfulness. But by virtue of not feeling connected to it and being caught up in the dynamic, individualized activities of the external world, the mind-body system is subject to stress, to excitations. Stress is a structural or material abnormality that gets produced in the human nervous system due to undue pressure of experience, overshadowing consciousness, overshadowing the physiology. And what happens with those great external excitations when we're under threat in different ways, because the mind and the body are intimately connected, when those excitations of the mind arise, there's going to be corresponding excitations in the human physiology. Those excitations in the human physiology, these excited biomarkers, we'll go over them in a second, create stresses in the nervous system. They create boundaries in the nervous system, which lead to ill health and eventually disease and all kinds of unhappiness. People know the effects of stress. So in modern science, we do call these impressions in the physiology stress. And it comes about due to what we call the stress response or the fight or flight syndrome. In Vedic science, if we want to use some Vedic terminology in the field of yoga darshana, we would call them sanskara or vasana. Mala is another word that could be used for stress or impurities in the nervous system. And essentially what happens in the stress response or the fight or flight response, which was an evolutionary system that was designed to protect us from danger, going back to primitive man, I'll give you an example of being in the stress response. So let's say you're driving down the interstate going very fast, 80, 85 miles an hour. People drive so fast in our area. You're in greater Atlanta. And you look down for a second to turn off the radio or turn off the air conditioning. And you look up and somebody stomped on the brakes in front of you. And you have a split second to do something to save your life. Now, at that time, you cannot use your prefrontal cortex, which is the chief executive officer of your brain that's responsible for discrimination and pros and cons and rights and wrongs and logic and all that. Otherwise, you'd slam into the back of the car. So at that point, you're functioning from your your primitive brain, your instinctual brain, sometimes called the reptilian brain, your sensory and your motor cortex. And you find yourself just stomping on the brakes without even thinking about it and screeching to a halt, and hopefully you don't hit the back of that car. But what are you feeling in that moment? You feel your heart is jumping out of your chest. You feel hot all over. You're sweating all of a sudden. You're breathing heavily. And you've gone into what's called the stress response. In the stress response, the prefrontal cortex goes offline. You're functioning from your emotional, impulsive, reactive center. You're not functioning from that higher CEO, chief executive officer of the brain. You might have had normal blood pressure before, and now you have high blood pressure, at least momentarily. Your heart rate goes up. It's pounding out of your chest. It's just beating not just faster, but harder as well. You're breathing heavier. So you're being, breath rate is a measure of restfulness in the body. Now you're breathing really heavy, meaning the body's the opposite of restful. It's extremely, very excited. And then a stress hormone called blood cortisol starts coursing through your system. And over time, what they've learned about this stress response is that the more often you go in, the more you go into it, the more easily people will tend to go into it in the future, because stress tends to accumulate over time if they don't have a remedy for it. And not only that, but when you go into the stress response, when on average people would go into the stress response for about an hour and a half or 2 hours, even after some stressful event is over, research shows that the more often you go into the stress response, you're likely over time, over the months and years of your life, to stay in the stress response for longer periods of time. And, this leads to high levels of blood cortisol in daily life. And it's correlated with that feeling of anxiousness and nervousness that people feel, that anxiety, that worry, that gotta mind, I gotta do this and gotta do that, and I can never be calm in the moment mind. It weakens the immune system. We get sick more easily. It increases aging. We're subject to more premature aging. It increases cardiovascular risk factors like high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and cardiac events like strokes and heart attacks. It can even alter the architecture of developing brains, and even to some degree, adult brains. It weakens our memory, our both short-term and long-term memory. It disturbs sleep, which is, of course, one of the worst things it does. When people sleep starts getting disturbed, everything else dumps down into a very unpleasant field of life. And in general, just weakens our ability to enjoy life. It might lead to loneliness and depression and other things in extreme cases, or post-traumatic stress disorder in the cases of acute stress. So the good news, though, is that the Vedas prescribe a remedy to all this, especially in that field of the Veda called the field of yoga, yoga darshana. And I just want to then read this quote from one of the most famous scriptures, the Shastras of yoga, which is Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which many of you, of course, know very well, and probably know this second sutra of the first pada, Yogash Chitta Vritta Nirodha, which is yoga is the complete settling of the activity of the mind. Yoga is the complete settling of the activity of the mind. And I could not create a better, very simple definition of what the technique that I learned when I was very young and have been teaching for many years, transcendental meditation, does. It settles the activity of the mind into the state of yoga. Yoga here means unity. It doesn't mean the postures that some people might be familiar with in yoga studios. It means the state of individual awareness settling down like an individual wave on the surface of the ocean, and settling down and becoming the unbounded infinite ocean itself. This is what yoga means, the settling of the activity of the mind. And it turns out that it's extraordinarily beneficial for the mind to do this, that it creates a state which is the mirror opposite of all these cardiovascular risk factors that I told you about that happen during the stress response. And so it reverses the effects of stress. Transcendental meditation, as you're going to learn, is not a stress management program. I have no interest in managing my stress. I would rather eliminate my stress. So transcendental meditation is a stress elimination program. So it systematically reduces stress over time. So a lot of people think of meditation as quieting the mind. And one approach to quieting the mind, you can use the analogy of waves again on the surface of the unbounded ocean. That if you tried to force the waves on the surface of an ocean to be still by pressing them down, you would find that very difficult to stop the natural fluctuations of the waves on the surface of the ocean. Just pressing down on the waves would create more wave activity. It'd be much easier to simply dive deep into the ocean. And as you dive deep within the ocean, systematically, the deeper and deeper you go into the ocean, the wave activity becomes less active, less active, less active, less active, and least active. And you would come to the depths of the ocean or the bottom of the ocean that's maybe a couple of miles deep, and it's absolute pure silence and peace and stillness, totally restful at the bottom of the ocean without the individual differentiation. The manyness of waves, that differentiation of waves has instead, it's the unbroken wholeness of the unbounded ocean itself. And what's important to note in this analogy is that this depths of the ocean, this unbounded silence of the ocean, is there at any time at the basis of everyone, at the basis of all the waves all the time that can be contacted anywhere. Like that, this unbounded infinite field of consciousness is at the source of your own thought. And we're going to talk about that a little bit to help you understand how this technique of settling the activity of the mind through this simple natural technique of transcendental meditation, which by the way is very easy to learn and very easy to do, practice twice a day for about 20 minutes, sitting comfortably in a chair, or if you want to sit in a yogic position, you could. But the idea here is that thoughts are nothing but fluctuating consciousness. In the same way that a wave is nothing but fluctuating ocean, and that you could reduce the fluctuations of the waves of the ocean and come to a state of the ocean that's absolutely still, like that, thoughts are nothing but vibrating or fluctuating consciousness. Consciousness interacting with itself, that self-referral quality of consciousness knowing itself, that vimarsha quality, creates a self-interacting dynamism, as Krishna said, prakritam svama vastabhya, curving back in my own nature. I create. So the creation of thought, the creation of the universe comes from this self-interaction. And so a thought starts from its source. So down here at the bottom of this chart, you see it says source of thought or pure consciousness, the unified field, Atman. This is the simplest form of human awareness. It is the ground state of all other thought and other experience, and as the continuum of the individual and unbounded knower of all other experience, you can therefore define it as what you are in your essence, and what you are in your essence is yourself. So Atman means the self. It's the cosmic, infinite, unbounded self at the basis of everyone's mind. There's one Atman, but 7 billion people in the world. There's one unbounded ocean and billions of waves on the surface of the ocean. And this field has qualities, as we talked about, unbounded, infinite bliss, pure silence, fully awake within itself. And a thought arises here at this source of thought through self-interaction. So here's the idea that an individual thought is arising like a bubble coming from the bottom of the ocean. A bubble starts off very tiny and rises to the surface and then expands due to water pressure becoming less. And as it rises, it becomes faster and faster, meaning it increases its activity as it reaches to the surface of the ocean and bursts as a fully developed bubble. This is an analogy for understanding how an individual thought, let's say the thought flower, emerges from that abstract unboundedness of consciousness. It starts off as a very faint self-referral vibration of consciousness that doesn't have any connection to meaning at the silent level of the mind, and it arises through the unconscious mind. For most people, it might be an unconscious level. And as it rises and becomes more concrete and more active, the individual thought reaches finally the subconscious or preconscious mind, where you might have a feeling for it, and then reaches the surface of the mind, the conscious thinking level. The active mind is a fully developed thought. The thought flower would just pop into your mind. So this is how thoughts arise from their source in consciousness. This happens very quickly, of course. Now, with transcendental meditation, what we do is reverse this experience. by simply, oops, excuse me, I've just got to do one thing. The idea here is that, I'll just start at the top, that imagine from the surface conscious thinking level of the mind, we can begin to be aware of an impulse of thought and experience that thought in the inward direction at less and less active stages of thinking. So we go down this sort of bubble diagram, so to speak. You don't literally go down when you transcend in transcendental meditation. It's just an analogy, but the mind is becoming less active until we experience this least active impulse of thought at the deepest silent level of the mind, and then transcend it and get to the source of thought itself, pure consciousness. We touch on this unbounded field of consciousness during meditation, and then we come out of meditation feeling more refreshed. And when there's this reduction in mental activity through TM, that means the mind is becoming increasingly restful in the transcending process. Because the mind and body are intimately connected, the physiology also becomes correspondingly very deeply rested. And research shows that in a very short period of time, the amount of rest gained during transcendental meditation is incredibly profound. Research shows that at about 6 or 7 hours of sleep, maybe 4 hours into the 8-hour sleep cycle for some people, they reach their deepest level of rest, which is measured by how much they're breathing. And there's maybe an 8% drop in oxygen consumption on average. Transcendental meditation, there are times when we completely transcend thought altogether. And for 10, 15, 20 seconds, you're in that absolute state of pure awareness in which breath stops altogether. It's incredibly deep rest. Average levels of rest are more than twice as much as the deepest part of deep sleep in a very short period of time. And all of the biomarkers that go up during the stress response that we mentioned, increased heart rate, blood pressure, et cetera, have been shown in scientific research studies to go down significantly during transcendental meditation. It creates a neurophysiology of consciousness, which is the mirror opposite of the physiology of the stress response. And so therefore, it allows the physiology's own equilibrium mechanisms, balancing mechanisms, self-healing mechanisms, not to just manage stress, but to begin to dissolve stress. So TM is a stress reduction program. It dissolves stress. So excuse me for a second. I move forward. Okay, this shows it in a different way, that at the basis of the mind is the samadhi. You may have heard the term samadhi in Sanskrit before, which means balanced intellect. This is that state of that unbounded ocean of consciousness beyond thought activity, where the waves of the fluctuations of thought settle down into the state of pure consciousness, where the seer is established in the self. Now, over here, it's showing how all of matter, as understood in physics, and right here in this smaller part is the four force and matter fields we went over, how all of physical matter also has its source in that same one unified field. So what's important to understand here is that the source of consciousness, the source of the mind, and the source of matter is the same one unbounded ocean of self-interacting pure intelligence. And because the laws of nature are the intelligent principles that create the universe, this field, according to physics, is pure intelligence. It's pure natural law, and pure intelligence is consciousness, self-referral, fully awake within its own nature. And I just want to read this quote from the Bhagavad Gita. Svalpam apya asya dharmasya trayate mahato bhayat. Even a little of this dharma, even a little of this practice of settling awareness into that unbounded field of bliss delivers one from great fear. Research shows that TM is very effective in dissolving stress. Now, I'm not going to go into the more than 350 peer-reviewed, published scientific research studies that have been published in scientific journals. It's incredibly well researched now, and there's absolutely no doubt anymore, as there was in the 70s when TM first came, when people doubted what meditation could do for you. There's no doubt about the tremendous scientifically proven benefits of TM, such as reduced stress and anxiety. When stress goes down, anxiety goes down, depression goes down, insomnia improves, blood pressure gets normalized, cholesterol improves. Strokes and heart attacks have been shown to be reduced with TM. There was a study showing that over 5 years of regular TM practice, can reduce strokes and heart attacks on average 47%. And for people in this study that were shown to be regular twice a day for 20 minutes in this program, there was on average a 66% reduction in strokes and heart attacks compared to the control group that it was compared to. And these were all people who started off with high blood pressure before they learned the TM program, or the control group that learned some health education program. There is no drug in the world that a cardiologist can give you that result, where they say, if I give you this pill, you're going to have that percentage of reduction in strokes and heart attacks, even though you're starting with somebody who's got a cardiovascular risk factor like high blood pressure. So there's just enormous amounts of benefits. A reduction in pain helps to control diabetes. It also improves brain function by creating coherence in the brain, improves intelligence, creativity, and learning ability. That leads to better school performance in students, increases longevity. It reduces substance abuse. There's just so many beautiful benefits of this practice that begin to unfold really from the very first sitting of transcendental meditation. You don't have to wait weeks or months before you start noticing profound neurophysiological changes that show up in your day-to-day activity, reducing stress, and improving life, waking up your full intelligence. TM is not just about reducing stress, but the research on brain functioning shows that it creates new neural connections in the brain. It brings the prefrontal cortex back online and begins to wake up total brain functioning and higher intelligence. So it's about also improving your life to your full infinite potential. And that's really where I want to take this talk now. That knowledge is structured in consciousness, and therefore knowledge is different in different states of consciousness, according to the Veda, Richo Akshare Parame Vyoman, that the waking state is a totally different state of consciousness than the dreaming state. So we're going to briefly review 7 states of consciousness, because I only have maybe 5 or 6, 7 more minutes left. But the 3 changing states of consciousness we're all familiar with, Jagrat, waking state, Swapna, which means dreaming, and Sushupti, sleeping, are relative changing states of consciousness. We come and go in these states in a 24-hour period. And every state of consciousness has its own corresponding neurophysiological state that gives rise to that state, and they are different from each other. With transcendental meditation, we begin to touch on a 4th major state of consciousness, in Sanskrit referred to as Turiya, which means the 4th state. This is that pure consciousness, or samadhi, that I mentioned, beyond the thinking process when we transcend with TM, which is the simplest state of yoga, or unity, the self of everyone. And in the beginning, this practice comes and goes and comes and goes. And every time it comes, we dissolve some stress from the past. And when we come out into activity, we feel more fresh and more alert and more stable in that inner silence. And because we feel more stable in that inner silence and activity, we don't take on as much new stress as we were in previous times. So if we begin to reduce stress during meditation, and with each meditation have deeper and clearer experiences of this inner state of unbounded pure consciousness, unbounded rest, and then begin to stabilize it through activity, then over time a state is reached in which all the stress gradually, systematically becomes dissolved in the nervous system. That there's a point that when you close your eyes to meditate, you would become that unbounded pure consciousness right away. And through having performed action in between 2 meditation times a day, you've conditioned or cultured the nervous system's ability to maintain that style of unbounded infinite consciousness along with waking, dreaming, and sleeping. Then that state in which pure consciousness becomes permanent is a 5th major state of consciousness. And this is based on a stress-free nervous system, where all the stress in the physiology has been systematically eliminated by systematic deeper and deeper levels of rest through regular meditation, and the resultant self-referral unbounded being that begins to grow, systematically becoming stabilized along with activity. As Lord Krishna said in chapter 2, verse 48, yoga sta kuru karmani, he told Arjuna, established in yoga, established an unbounded awareness, sta, to establish, kuru karmani, perform action. And this is the state known as Turiya Chetna, a 5th major state of consciousness, and really the first stage of real enlightenment, real moksha, or liberation from the endless wheels of stress and birth and death, called cosmic consciousness in English. And it's defined as living Atman, pure consciousness, the fourth state, along with, but separate from, the three changing relative states of consciousness of waking, dreaming, and sleeping. It's a state of pure duality, where all the manyness of outer experience has settled down to a state of duality of the absolute self, which you are now established in. You've transcended even ego, individual ego, and become unbounded cosmic mind, cosmic ego. And that absolute self is what you now are. You feel as if witnessing the relative non-changing, the relative changing self or non-self, because you're no longer identified with the body and the thinking mind and the intellect, or the individual ego, which is attached to these things, as yourself anymore. You now think of you now experience, not on the level of thinking, but as a living, ecstatic reality, that you are that unbounded ocean of consciousness, but you're separate from the dynamic waves of activity in the outer objective field of matter. Now the body is separate from the self, the mind is separate from the self, the intellect and ego is separate from the self, and so is this whole universe. So you still perceive the outside world and its boundaries and its level of outside boundaries. You don't see the absolute pure consciousness at the basis of this external universe, nor do you understand how that absolute intelligence gets transformed by the creator into this universe yet. That happens in time as a result of gaining cosmic consciousness as a foundation when there's no stress left in the nervous system, that the senses of your physiology, the perceptive faculties of the nervous system, get raised up to their highest level of glorification. The finest level of human perception is now, you're now capable of the finest level of human perception, because you have removed all the impurity and all the stresses, and the different faculties of the five senses become very refined over a systematic development of love and devotion, of bhakti. This is really where bhakti really comes in a huge way, where the ability to love goes from like a small pond, which can rise up in little in small waves or ripples, where the pond gets expanded to the status of the unbounded ocean of life, where it can rise up in tidal waves of love, tidal waves of devotion. And love is that which brings opposites together. So on the one hand, this relative field of change begins to start to be unified with your own field of internal non-change through a very refined heart and physiology. It also happens as a result of a very fine biochemistry that gets produced in the physiology of a stress-free nervous system. In the Veda, it's called soma or amrita, which is the finest output of a person in cosmic consciousness. And from their physical digestion, it produces this quality of soma, which refines the senses, which starts to perceive subtler and subtler aspects of the objects of perception until one can finally perceive the finest aspect of creation. The place really, which is, if I point here on this chart, to where the unbounded unified field begins to manifest, where the unbounded unity has its personality in the individuated creator that creates this entire universe and administrates it. So this field of Bhagavat Chaitanya, or God consciousness, the sixth state of consciousness, is characterized by perceiving externally in the objects in the outer universe that creator itself, and having a direct perception and experience of the creator. It's ecstatic God self-realization. The thought of bread will never satisfy a hungry person. Only direct experience of eating bread will satisfy a hungry person. Like that, the thought of God is not God. It's inspiring and motivating to stay on the path to God realization, but the real experience of God is a living experience in this state of consciousness based on a highly refined neurophysiology. And then finally, it has its culmination in the seventh state of consciousness, in which the absolute value of the outer object is perceived, not just the finest relative at the junction point of outer matter, but the actual unified field, which is your own self, begins to be experienced in the outer objects of perception. Formerly, you'd experienced it subjectively in cosmic consciousness. Now you're also experiencing that unboundedness at the basis of the whole entire physical universe. When it expands from the individual perception to the whole universe simultaneously, where the whole universe itself is experienced as one's own unbounded self, as the unitary transformations of one's own universal self-referral consciousness, that is what's called the seventh state of consciousness. total enlightenment, total Jivan Mukti, liberation, called Brahmi Chetana, or Brahman consciousness, the great, the wholeness being greater than the sum of the parts, of wholeness of all the infinities of individual perception combined to create an infinity of all infinities, where the self is experienced as one owns, the whole universe is experienced as one's own nature. This is the ultimate human empowerment. And by the way, when you experience this state, if this becomes a living reality, you don't lose the perception and the experience of the individual personalized form of the creator either. Now, I did want to go into more about the 7 states, but I've really talked too long already. And so I think we'll stop right here and we can take questions, I think. So let me stop share. There's time for questions. I'll take some questions.
Hi, this is Rama Rao.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I mean, you made very interesting points. I've been interested in physics and Vedanta for a long time. And, as you learn more and more about fundamental aspects of physics, relating gravity with quantum theory, and we are trying to understand how matter and energy behaves in space-time. And the laws of physics, the classical physics, or the relativity and quantum physics, tries to explain 2 different aspects of one world: the macroscopic and quantum scale particles. So we live in one world, and we are made of both fundamental particles and also the big molecules, and we share the cosmos. So where does this combine? So our understanding of the fundamentals of how matter and energy behaves in space-time is the space-time itself is ignored for a long time in classical physics, where it is treated as a static picture, at least in Newtonian physics. But Einstein changed that to say that space-time is just nothing but a bending of space light in presence of matter. And now quantum mechanics, when it tries to understand gravity, the whole theory collapses. And now they are looking at how space and time exist. And if you look more at quantum mechanics, the matter and energy can be formed in quantum vacuum out of nothing. So there is energy, there is quantum energy, but there is nothing because it's vacuum. But particles and antiparticles are formed constantly and annihilate and go back to.
I think they call it the 0-point fluctuations
That's
of the
right.
vacuum state. Yeah, if I
That's right.
remember correctly.
So,
and I'm not a physicist, by the way, so
yeah. So that's a good point. Yeah, as we learn more and more about the Big Bang and the origin of the cosmos and the black holes, where the matter and energy crunches into nothingness, and they're coming to the belief that the matter and energy behaves in certain ways in space-time, but everything collapses into nothingness, and there the pure consciousness pervades. So everything we are understanding proves what Vedanta says, that there is pure consciousness everywhere from which space-time evolves, and that matter energy evolves, and the laws of physics tries to explain the cosmic level physics and the subatomic particle physics. But they're still missing consciousness. But in interpreting quantum reality, they bring consciousness, the conscious observer. And conscious observer is a part and parcel of quantum physics. Without conscious observer, the reality cannot be explained. So there is consciousness perceived in quantum physics, but it doesn't appear in any equations.
Right. They know the observer affects the object, definitely, yes. But they can't, most physicists just don't really like to talk about consciousness.
That's right.
But there are some pioneering physicists like Dr. John Hagelin and Roger Penrose who are trying to talk about physics in the consciousness in the light of physics.
I understand from the point of physicists, because if you're speaking to a group of physicists, they think that you are out of your mind in consciousness, which is not in equations. But, if you go back in the history, people like Edwin Schrodinger, the father of wave mechanics, and, Niels Bohr, some of the fathers of quantum mechanics, founding fathers, had strong interest in Vedanta. especially Schrodinger. Now, according to his biographer, he was a lifelong Vedantin, and he deeply believed that consciousness played a very important role in creating the cosmos.
Beautifully
This
said.
is in early 1920s.
Mhm.
And everything we are learning from quantum mechanics prove the central point of Vedanta.
Yes, very, very true, very true. And there's one little point in physics I want to point out to you. If you're wondering how in this seventh state of consciousness, Brahman consciousness, that you could perceive externally through the five senses and perceive that the objects of perception are nothing but consciousness. How could that be? Because when we look observantly on the surface of life, when we're not in that state of enlightenment, we just see inert matter, the world of billiard balls and finite classical objects. But one physicist I heard talk about something very interesting. I'll just bring up this little point. He said, if you take the atom and if you blew an atom up to the size of this is a quantum physicist, if you blow the atom up to the size where the nucleus of the atom, the proton, neutron at the nucleus of the atom, if you made it the size of the head of a pin, and if you were to stick that pin in the 50-yard line of a football field, like say we live here in Atlanta where there's Mercedes-Benz Stadium where the Falcons play, if you were to stick that pin at the 50-yard line in the center and you're looking at the proton neutron nucleus of that atom, the size of the head of a pin, then the relative distance of the electron orbital shell to that nucleus would be as if the electron was rotating on the outside of Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Meaning all that empty space in between is mostly what an atom is. It's mostly empty vacuum. And he said, if you took the entire human race and you could remove the vacuum out of all of the space between all of the electrons and the proton neutron nucleuses of all the atoms that make up the human race, if you took out all that empty space and collapsed it down to anything that we can even begin to say is particulate in nature, material in nature, he said you could fit the entire human race on the first digit of your little finger. So what you think is solid space is really absolute Chitakasha, if we want to use a Sanskrit term, so to speak. Okay.
Anybody else? Anybody else has questions?
There were some written questions, I think, in the chat.
Anjali-ji,
Yeah,
William.
can you?
There's one question. How is transcendental meditation different from the practice of yoga as taught by sage Patanjali?
And the answer to that is absolutely there is no difference. I'm here to tell you that that definition of Patanjali Yogas Chittavritti Nirota is the best description of transcendental meditation it could possibly give you. It's the settling down of the fluctuations of the mind. In reality, there's many technologies in the field of yoga that could settle the mind down. So Patanjali didn't get very specific about how to settle the mind down in his Yoga Sutras. He did talk about Ashtanga yoga, and but he talked about the process of the eight limbs of yoga and coming to the state of samadhi through dharana and dhyan, etc. But the methodologies he didn't go in. He did talk about asana a little bit, which is the postures, which is a physiological technology to prepare the physiology to have the experience of subjective unbounded consciousness, of dharana, the point value, settling down. Dhyan is that transcending quality into samadhi, pure awareness. So really, there's no difference. I would say the answer to that is there is no difference.
That's wonderful. And if you had to, I guess, if you were talking to an executive of a board and helping them to understand better what their takeaway was from the talk or what they could start doing tomorrow to alleviate their stresses, what would be that one message that you would encapsulate your talk with?
I would say run, don't walk, run to your closest transcendental meditation teacher and learn TM or learn some methodology of yoga to achieve this unbounded field of being. It's a very systematic thing. Anyone can do it. It's very simple to learn. You have to start it. You have to do it in order to experience that state. But the good news is transcending with TM is very simple and natural. This is not based on concentration or forcing the mind. Because if I were to go back to that bubble diagram, I'm not going to go back right now, but that reduction of the mental activity into pure consciousness is a path of decreasing mental activity, which means to get to that state, the mind has to become absolutely restful. It has to give up effort. So transcending is a path of increasing effortlessness. It happens through effortlessness. So the technology of transcendental meditation and the details, which I unfortunately don't have time to go into right now, it takes 4 sessions of learning over 4 consecutive days, about 2 hours each day to learn it. It happens through effortlessness. TM is easy. 10-year-olds with ADHD can transcend. There is nothing more natural than transcendence in this universe. And this is what people need more of. They need that transcendence. So I didn't show my slide with my email address of mcohen@tm.org, MCOHEN@tm.org. If anybody wants to look more into TM, how to learn it, if you want to learn it here in Atlanta. And if you're somewhere else and you want to learn TM, then if you contact me, I'll help you get in touch with a certified teacher of transcendental meditation in your area. There's also a wonderful book that's come out, at least as an e-reader, called One Unbounded Ocean of Consciousness by Dr. Tony Nader, MD, PhD, brilliant guy from MIT, who's written a kind of a scientific and Vedic book tackling the problem of consciousness, or the issue of consciousness, as One Unbounded Ocean of Consciousness that I highly recommend you might want to read if you want to learn more about this from a very good scientific point of view too. So.
Well, that's wonderful, Mark. I tell you, it was a fantastic presentation. And one thing that comes to my mind is that when you and I were there in 1973 with Maharishi, the only thing I could recognize, because his accent was very thick, you remember this, very thick.
Yeah.
And I'm this young guy, a musician, my brain is like somewhere else, right? But the one word that stuck out, unbounded.
Unbounded.
Whenever Maharishi said that word, unbounded, I could catch it. So all the things I didn't catch in 1973, I caught tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Prabhu. I remember that talk I remember being there very well. And what I remember is I couldn't focus. There was something about Marshi's presence that just expanded your awareness.
Yeah.
It was hard to focus on a point, but I do remember feeling like this feeling I've got being around him and seeing him. I want to have more of that. That's what I think I got as a young boy, because I was 14 years old, maybe 15 at the time.
Wow. Yeah. Well, again, on behalf of VFA, I just have to say thank you so much. And I know we're going to connect more and do more programs together.
Thank you.
And so I think we'll close out here. Thank you, everybody, for participating tonight. And we will have more programs going in the next few months, and we'll keep you all updated. Please go to Vedic Friends Association.org to get updates on what we're doing. So thank you very much. Namaste. Hare Krishna. Everyone have a wonderful, safe evening, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you very much. Namaste.
Thank you.
Mark, if you can stay on for just a moment.
Yes.